When 3 women vanish without a trace, investigators comb for clues and find themselves on the trail of a savvy serial killer. Without witnesses, detectives are at a total loss to find a missing woman. To solve this case requires an act of God. When a woman disappears from under her own roof, investigators suspect that she was murdered. But getting to the bottom of it will require some sophisticated technology. Most murder investigations begin with a body. But when the body is missing, detectives face the ultimate challenge: catching a killer when the victim is presumed dead.
Tips hotline.
It was a Monday, June 19th, 1989, when police in the Kansas City suburb of Overland Park, Kansas, received a call from worried parents. Their daughter, 24-year-old Joan Butler, hadn't shown up for work that morning. She hadn't even phoned in. No one had seen her since early the day before.
That's interesting because...
Though she had been gone just over 24 hours, her parents were convinced something terrible must have happened to prevent her from contacting anyone.
And in the town that he grew up in, which
Police agreed to check on her.
that's a small town.
When investigators searched Joan's apartment with one of her friends, they found no sign of her. And according to Detective Pat Hinkle, no sign that she planned on being away.
No bags had been packed. Her makeup was still around the sink. No clothing appeared to have been removed from the apartment, so the only thing missing was Joan.
They learned that Joan had spent Saturday night with her girlfriends.
Yeah, they're great.
At 4 a.m. Sunday, she went home.
I love you. That explains it. Thanks again. I'll call you tomorrow.
That was the last time they saw her. Joan Butler wasn't the kind of person to leave without a word. She saw her parents at least once a week and socialized often with her friends. She wouldn't miss work without good reason. In her apartment, her friend pointed out to police the clothes Joan was last seen wearing, so she had definitely made it home. But her purse, wallet, and her car were missing. By roll call Tuesday morning, the mystery had deepened. A check of Butler's bank account revealed that $300, the daily maximum, had been withdrawn from an ATM at 6 a.m. Sunday, just 2 hours after she was last seen. It happened again early Monday and early Tuesday. All the ATMs were in the Kansas City area. None had video cameras. The pattern suggested that someone else was in control of Joan Butler's account, and maybe in control of Joan.
He had gone down and played, I don't know if you remember.
Her family and friends posted leaflets all over Kansas City, describing Joan and her car and pleading for help to find her. Her disappearance made the news, but turned up no leads. Until 1 week later. On June 25th, police got their first tip.
Sir, can I speak
Joan's
to you for a minute?
car had been spotted outside an apartment complex 40 miles from her home. The man with Joan's keys told the officer that he borrowed them from his buddy inside. The officer suggested they go in and sort things out. The suspect began to escort the officer inside, then took off. He caught the policeman by surprise and made an agile escape. The officer learned that the fugitive was a painting contractor named Ricky Cho, and the men were his crew. They also told him that Cho recently started driving a new red car, Joan Butler's car. When police examined the trunk, they discovered part of the carpet had been cut away. They also found a dark stain. They presumed it was Joan Butler's blood. According to Detective Hinkle, if that were the case, it would prove that she hadn't left of her own free will.
Any experienced officer would then suspect that possibly the trunk had been used for the storage of the person who belonged to the car, you know, the missing person.
Investigators couldn't be certain it was Joan's blood without having a sample from her to compare it to. They hoped a new forensic technique called reverse paternity could help them. It works on the theory that a person's DNA shares the same traits as the DNA of her parents. By taking a close look at both parents' DNA, investigators could estimate what their children's DNA might look like. Blood samples would have to be taken from Butler's mother and father. Then the DNA from the blood found in Joan Butler's car would be extracted and compared. The meticulous process would take weeks.
Unicorn.
While awaiting analysis of the stain, detectives ran a background check on Ricky Cho. The name turned out to be an alias, one of many. His real name was Richard Grissom. He was a 28-year-old ex-con with a rap sheet almost as old as he was.
Utility to Heather Keaton of Shawnee.
His criminal background included a history of forgery, a history of auto theft, and a prior conviction of homicide in which he killed an elderly woman in the city of Leavenworth, Kansas.
He was charged as a juvenile in that crime and served only a few years before he was back on the street. Grissom's father was African American and his mother was Asian, giving him a striking combination of features that allowed him to drastically alter his appearance. Throughout a decade of crime and disguise, he had evaded capture. Police worked the equation: a young woman's sudden disappearance, a drained bank account, and a stolen car. Factor in a convicted killer named Richard Grissom, and the result pointed to kidnapping, possibly murder. If Joan Butler wasn't dead yet, investigators feared she soon would be. Police fanned out across Kansas City, interviewing friends and colleagues of Grissom, but no one admitted seeing him. After Joan Butler's bank account was emptied, her trail evaporated too. Investigators had no more leads. Then, on Monday, June 26th, David Roosh received a message that his daughter Christine was sick and wouldn't be coming into his optical lab where she worked. Later that day, Roosh went to her home to check on her. She wasn't there. Neither was her roommate, Teresa Brown, who had also called in sick. Christine's car was gone. Neither woman had checked into a hospital, and none of their friends had seen them. The women seemed to have simply vanished.
Good day.
The next day, their families filed missing persons reports.
Hey, you're here.
Both women were well liked, with close families and friends.
Might go out tonight?
Don't think so.
Christine, age 22, enjoyed working at her dad's shop. Teresa, also 22, had saved enough money to enroll in college. Neither woman had any problems to speak of, and neither was the kind to shirk her responsibilities. Their behavior, like the mess in their home, was out of character. Detectives combed the apartment for clues. Their wallets were missing, but oddly, a curling iron was left on. It was all very disturbing, especially so soon after the disappearance of Joan Butler. Detectives collected hairs and fibers, including 2 dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding that didn't seem to belong to either woman. No blood was found in the apartment, no weapon, no sign of forced entry or struggle. In short, no evidence of a crime. The front door hadn't been forced. If there had been an intruder, it was either someone the women knew or someone with a key. It wasn't much of a case to hand District Attorney Paul Morrison.
We didn't have a crime scene here. What we had was a lot of different fragments, and so our task was to try to see what we could put together from that and build a scenario and piece together what we think happened.
Detectives learned that passkeys had been given to a painting company, Richard Grissom's painting company. What began as a missing persons case now looked like a spree of kidnappings. The day after police searched Christine and Teresa's apartment, Christine's abandoned car was found a few hundred yards from her home. On the driver's side fender were fresh flecks of blue paint, but inside they found no viable clues. Later, a check of the roommate's bank records showed another sinister parallel with Joan Butler. Their accounts were quickly drained through multiple transactions. But if investigators hoped to link Richard Grissom to the missing women, they'd need solid proof. It surfaced in the lab when the dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding were analyzed. The hairs proved to be of African-Asian origin, like the suspect. That wasn't the only link. From Grissom's employees, police learned that he had rented a storage locker for his business. Detectives obtained a search warrant to have a look. Inside, they collected some hairs. And outside, a potentially bigger clue, a 6-foot length of duct tape, wadded up and embedded with hair.
About every 8 inches, there was a large number of long human hairs, and then a space, and then long human hairs, as if the tape had been used as a gag, had been wrapped around the mouth of someone.
Investigators hoped this was what they needed to link Grissom to the victims. They compared the hairs on the tape to those gathered from the missing women's hairbrushes. But the sun had bleached the hair found on the roof, making a definitive comparison impossible. That, along with the gag, suggested she had been held there against her will. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why was there no sign of her roommate, Teresa Brown, or of Joan Butler? Where were the women now? While investigators pondered these questions, the case progressed on another front. The results from the testing of the bloodstain found in Joan Butler's trunk had come back from the lab. The DNA in the sample closely matched DNA from her parents. Physical evidence now linked Grissom to 2 of the 3 victims. Their whereabouts and Grissom's remained a mystery. As police searched for Richard Grissom, their hunt led them from Kansas City to Grandview, Missouri, 22 miles away. Grissom's own car was found abandoned in a parking lot. It was taken to the police impound lot, where detectives spent 5 hours processing the incriminating contents. They found false IDs and stolen credit cards, some belonging to Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown. Police also found keys to their apartment, to the home of Joan Butler, and dozens of others. Family members were brought in to identify the items. The evidence connecting the criminal to his victims was now more than circumstantial. But so far, it was moot. Richard Grissom was even now on the lam, and police were no closer to catching him. Christine Roosh's father identified 3 rings belonging to his daughter. But still, no sign of Christine. 3 days into the investigation, hopes of finding the women alive were fading. As police continued to dig, they learned through an informant that on the very day that Roosh and Brown disappeared, Grissom had rented a second storage locker in the Kansas City suburb of Stanley. He stopped using it just 3 days later. The manager told police a young woman had paid for the unit, but she filled out the application under the direction of a man. The manager couldn't positively identify Grissom's picture. She recalled that the woman seemed distressed, like she needed help. She signed her name Roosh. Yet the woman the manager identified in the photo was Teresa Brown. There seemed no reason for Teresa to impersonate Christine, unless she had no choice. Detectives searched the locker, but found no signs of violence or other leads. Then, on their way out, they spotted something familiar: blue paint.
This storage facility had a computerized gate access where you have to drive up, punch in a series of codes, your PIN, if you will, and then it would allow you entry into the storage facility. The poles were set rather close to the touchpad, and it was apparent that several cars had run into these poles in the past.
The paint was similar to the paint found on Christine's car. Police took chips from the poles and the vehicle and sent them to the Johnson County Crime Lab, where forensic examiner Gary Dirks analyzed them.
The question paint chip displayed no differences when compared against known paint that was removed from a blue concrete pole beside the storage shed that Richard Grissom rented.
The blue chip helped police paint a picture of what might have happened in the storage shed.
Our belief of the coming and goings from this storage facility was that that's where he was hiding out. That's where he was hiding from the police, and that's where he most likely was hiding Christine Roosh and very possibly Teresa Brown.
As Kansas City police continued their search for 3 missing women, a final clue turned up on the other side of town, courtesy of an 18-year-old Good Samaritan. He was on his way home from work when he spotted something on the roadside. It seemed someone had lost their valuables: a checkbook, credit cards, receipts, and other papers. The young man decided to contact the owner. Her name was Christine Roosh. Police found 4 checks unaccounted for in the ledger. They were traced and recovered. On the morning of Monday, June 26th, the day Christine called in sick, she cashed them at the drive-up windows of 4 branches of her bank. Within an hour, her account was emptied of $2,400. None of the transactions were filmed, but police believed Grissom was with Christine.
You can look at her checks as she signs them that morning. Clearly, Christine Roosh, very steady, legible handwriting. With each check, the signature degrades more and more and more to the point that the last one, you almost can't read it. And you can only imagine, Christine sitting in the front seat of a car, knowing that what her fate might be.
At 10 p.m. that same day, Christine drove to an ATM in Belton, Missouri, and cleaned out the bank account of her friend, Teresa Brown. Police believed by this point Grissom had already killed Teresa, and Christine was next. These are the last photos taken of Christine alive.
Local media.
Kansas City police were desperate to capture the elusive Richard Grissom.
Sheet of construction paper and called it the many
Then
faces
they got a
Richard
break. Grissom slipped up and told friends where he was heading. They informed the police, who apprehended him in Texas and brought him back to Kansas.
You grow up in the area?
Leavenworth. Well,
The police still had no bodies, but they had a long chain of evidence leading to Richard Grissom. Besides the stolen jewelry and emptied bank accounts, they amassed a wealth of forensic evidence: bloodstains, paint flakes, and hair samples.
Each forensic piece of evidence by itself probably did not make or break the case, but the consistent thing about all those small pieces of evidence were that they all pointed directly at Richard Grissom as being the perpetrator of these crimes.
On November 4th, 1990, Richard Grissom was convicted of kidnapping, robbery, theft, fraud, and murder. He's serving multiple life sentences in the Kansas State Prison. Grissom never explained what happened back in Kansas City, but police have their own theories. Grissom had keys to the apartment of Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown, so getting in was no problem for him. He'd also done work in Joan Butler's apartment complex and obtained a key for her unit as well. To this day, the whereabouts of the missing women remains a mystery, closely guarded by Richard Grissom.
I think Grissom is a true power freak, and I believe that this is his last act of defiance, that he was able to get over on the police, be able to prove that he is superior in some manner, because the investigators have never been able to find the bodies, and I think that's his last card.
A determined, experienced killer can tax a police department's resources, but so can a killer who acts on impulse. Elizabeth, New Jersey is an industrial town and a residential suburb of New York City. Like any city, it has its share of crime, and its police force is trained to handle whatever might come up, through deadly force or shrewd detective work. Once a criminal is in their sights, they don't give up. Shortly after 6 a.m. on Wednesday, August 5th, 1992, a mechanic arrived for work at his auto shop. He spotted a car parked out front that didn't belong there. He found out the owner was Karen Sherrier. He phoned her to pick up her car, but her parents said she wasn't home. They hadn't heard from her in 2 days. Her family was alarmed to learn that Karen hadn't shown up for work, that her car had been abandoned. Her sister reported her missing. Detective Christopher Kenny was assigned to the case.
The family was definitely concerned right from the beginning. It was unlike her to not call anybody or contact anybody over a period of time. She has a lot of friends located here in Elizabeth. Her family was down ashore, and she would be in touch with someone. At this time, she hadn't called anyone or spoke to anyone.
From the family, police learned that Karen had gone out for a night on the town 2 days before. One of the bars she stopped in was right across the street from where her car was found. On the same day that Karen Sherrier was reported missing, police launched a search to pick up her trail. It led 3 blocks away to the City of Elizabeth Recreation Pier along the Elizabeth River. There, a police dog picked up Karen's scent going onto the pier. And then the trail went cold. The search for Karen Sherrier took New Jersey detectives back to the last place she was seen, the bar across the street from where her car was parked. The owner and one of his customers recalled seeing Karen early on the morning of Tuesday, August 4th. She was with a man named Joseph Zabita. Detectives called Zabita in for questioning after learning that he had been paroled from prison just a few months before. According to Detective Kenny, at this point, he seemed a likely suspect.
The criminal history showed that he had been arrested numerous times in the past, and that he had also been arrested for a rape and had spent time in prison for a rape.
Zabita admitted being with Sherrier the night she vanished. He explained they went bar hopping on Monday the 3rd, and early on the morning of the 4th wound up at a tavern on Front Street. He said Sherrier was giving him a ride home when they passed a man she knew. She stopped. Zabita got out. The other man got in. That, Zabita said, was the last time he saw Karen. He said he didn't know the other man's name or where they were going. During the interview, detectives noticed a crescent-shaped bruise on Zabita's arm. He explained he had caught it in the tailgate of a pickup truck. He allowed the detectives to take photographs for the record.
Once we were done interviewing him and talking to him that evening, we had to let him go because we had no evidence to hold him.
Still, detectives didn't buy Zabita's story. The bruise on his arm looked a lot like a bite mark. To be sure, they sent the photographs to forensic dental consultant Haskell Askin.
I did determine upon looking at the photographs that this was, in my opinion, a human bite mark, and it was a matter of finding the teeth to match up with this bite mark.
If Karen Sherrier made that mark, it would prove that more went on than Zabita admitted. But to match the teeth that made the mark, investigators still had to find Sherrier. The next day, they were back on the waterfront. This time, they brought along an officer from the New Jersey State Police Missing Persons Unit. Again, the search was futile. With no word from Karen Sherrier and no reason for her to disappear on her own, investigators had to assume she was dead. Detective Kenny had no motive, no evidence, no body, and no case. Still, he kept his suspect in his sights. Zabita was the last person seen with Karen Sherrier.
We would call Mr. Zabita in, we would speak to him, talk to him again. He stayed to his story, basically, and We spent about 3 months just trying to find Karen Sherrier's body.
Police had tried everything, from interviewing witnesses to tracking with bloodhounds, and had come up empty. The victim's family applied pressure to keep looking.
Karen Sherrier's family and friends came to us and they requested that we do a search. They wanted to do a search. They felt like they wanted to do something to try to find her. They told us they would go out, they would make up flyers, they would get volunteers.
Investigators agreed to one more search. But then, Mother Nature intervened. The worst storm in a century walloped the New Jersey coast, churning up the entire Elizabeth River waterfront. Once the flooding subsided, Sherrier's family insisted that the search proceed. Some 30 police officers, firefighters, and civilians combed the banks of the Elizabeth River, not far from where Karen's car had been found. But the odds of finding anything now seemed astronomical. They searched all day without turning up anything. Then, near the railroad bridge, a searcher noticed something in the weeds a few feet from the water's edge. He'd found a human skull. It was apparently washed up by the storm, then left behind as the waters receded. It was an amazing find, but was it the remains of Karen Sherrier? The teeth would provide proof positive, except that every last one of them was missing. The search for Karen Sherrier turned up a skull in the Elizabeth River, but without the teeth, the first solid clue seemed utterly useless. Investigators brought Haskell Askin back on the case to apply his expertise. His first finding was unsettling.
Examination of the skull suggested to me that the teeth had been forcibly or traumatically removed from the skull.
Even though the teeth were missing, Askin found distinguishing traits in the skull. The shape of the sockets where the teeth had been, the shape of the roots, and a distinctively shaped bone along the sinuses. Askin then compared his findings to skull x-rays taken by Sherrier's dentist. There was no doubt in Askin's mind. The skull was Karen Sherrier's. Armed with these findings, detectives returned to the Zabita household and served an arrest warrant on Joseph Zabita. Down at the station, he revised his story.
We explained to him what we believe happened. We told him what evidence we did have. After talking with Joe Zabita for a little bit of time, Joe Zabita admitted to us that he did, in fact, kill Karen Sherrier.
As before, Zabita said they left the tavern in the victim's car. By now, they had spent several hours together, and he had slowly won Sherrier's trust. Then, he betrayed it. They drove to an access road down by the Elizabeth River. There, he ordered her to stop the car. They began to fight, and Zabita hit Karen in the face. He couldn't recall how many times.
He struck her. Once he struck her, she wasn't moving. He was nervous, worried.
Zabita left her there. Then he parked her car across from the auto body shop and walked home.
What happened there?
Zabita never explained why he cut off the victim's head. Police speculate that Zabita, worried after being questioned about the crime, returned to the scene and tried to destroy the victim's physical identification. In our legal system, a confession may not guarantee a conviction. Cases are won on the merits of the evidence. Without the victim's teeth, investigators couldn't prove she made the bite mark on Zabita's arm. They had nothing to definitively link the suspect to her. So they asked Zabita to show them where he dumped the body. Police divers never found the remains. Detectives built their case on what they had. Eyewitnesses who saw Zabita with the victim on her last night alive, and the x-rays of the victim's skull. Joseph Zabita pled guilty to aggravated manslaughter and was sentenced to life in prison. He won't be eligible for parole for 25 years. Investigators traced Karen Sherrier's murder to a chance meeting with a sinister stranger. Detectives in South Portland, Maine, had far less to go on. On August 16, 1991, police were called to the home of William and Pearl Bruns. Pearl's daughter, Elaine, was worried because she hadn't heard from her mother in 3 days.
So when was the last time you spoke with your mother?
Pearl never went far from home and always phoned her. Detective Linda Barker spoke with Elaine.
The daughter was very adamant that her mother always called her at least once or twice during the week.
She calls me like 2-3 times a week. I haven't heard from her in a couple of days now. And that's
Inside,
unusual?
the first thing the detective noticed was droplets of dried blood starting in the kitchen sink and trailing through the house.
I saw drops of blood at the sink. I saw drops of blood as you go into the bathroom and in the bathroom sink. Indeed, there was a lot of drops of blood in various places throughout the home.
Elaine explained that her mother was a hemophiliac and bled easily when cut. Pearl had cut herself in the kitchen on the day Elaine last saw her and had rushed to the bathroom to dress the wound.
Want me to show you the rest of the house? Sure.
Along the way, she must have left a trail. Aside from the disconcerting bloodstains, most of the Bruns' home was neat and orderly, but the bedroom was a shambles.
Yeah, I don't know where she would have been going, but this is not the way she passed.
It looked as though Pearl was interrupted while packing to leave.
Oh, look, there's some more blood.
On the suitcase were more drops of blood.
Like I said, even a small cut. Well, I mean, it's unusual just that, she...
On the bookcase, Elaine noticed something that upset her more than the blood.
Well, she never took
her
this
mother's
ring off.
friendship
This is
ring.
From her best friend. She got it 14 years ago, and it's never...
Elaine explained that Pearl never went anywhere without it.
And you just now found that?
Yes.
She also said that Pearl had not taken her car. Pearl loved her Cadillac, and it was still sitting in the garage. And she said there was no way her mother would leave without her beloved Cadillac.
The Cadillac might have been the only beloved thing in the home. After 5 years, the Bruns' marriage had soured. Elaine said when she last saw Pearl, she was depressed. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her husband complained of Pearl's spending. Pearl had told Elaine, "I'd be better off dead." She wondered if Pearl might have done something rash. There was no sign of her anywhere in the house. The one place the Portland police hadn't looked was a place Pearl rarely ventured: the cellar. They didn't find her, but they found more blood. It was red, not brown, so it looked fresh.
You do agree this does look like it's blood?
With Pearl nowhere to be found, the logical person to question was her husband, William. He was a truck driver who was out on the road. When he returned, William Bruns recapped his last day with Pearl. After Elaine left, he said, an argument broke out over the same old thing: money. Around 6 that evening, he left the house. He said he went to a donut shop, ran some errands, then stopped for dinner. When he got home, Pearl wasn't there. She didn't return, and he never gave it another thought.
It became very apparent that she didn't just leave, and he just didn't care. And I have a photograph of her here.
Barker launched an exhaustive investigation into the whereabouts of Pearl Bruns. She questioned neighbors. She visited Pearl's old haunts. No one had seen Pearl since she'd been reported missing. Next, Barker phoned taxi services, bus depots, and airlines. Every call was a dead end. If Pearl had left town, it seemed she'd gone on her own 2 feet, or hadn't really left at all. With no sign of Pearl, the detective returned to speak with William Bruns. A casual remark turned into a potential clue.
I said, "Gee, Bill, you've had your carpet cleaned." And he goes, "Oh, no, I haven't cleaned it at all." And I said, "Well, then you've replaced it. I mean, this is like brand new rug. I mean, that's how clean it was." And he said, "No, I haven't cleaned it and I haven't replaced it."
But a check with neighbors revealed that he had rented a commercial carpet cleaner a few days earlier. Why he would cover up such a trivial matter made investigators only more suspicious. By now, 2 months had passed since Pearl Bruns had dropped out of sight. No one had seen her or heard from her. The police suspected she wasn't simply missing, but murdered. They'd handled the case as a homicide. They used cadaver dogs to continue their search. They combed rivers and woods and other places where a body would likely be concealed. None turned up. Their main suspect was William Bruns, who still seemed unconcerned about his wife's disappearance. Bruns drove his refrigerated delivery truck throughout New England and into Canada. If he were the killer, he could have disposed of his wife anywhere. A check of the truck revealed it had been scrubbed clean. No traces of blood were found. In Maine, homicide investigations are conducted by the state police. Sergeant Mike Harriman was assigned to the case. Harriman began with the Brunses' home, if only to rule it out.
We wanted to better search the home and the surrounding areas to see if possibly Pearl's remains were within the home, in the basement, or in the surrounding area, possibly buried in a shallow grave.
On November 17th, investigators paid another visit to William Bruns. This time, they brought a cadaver dog to search the woods around the house. The search was another dead end. In the cellar, the dog detected something. Yet when police dug, they found nothing.
It likely will be.
While the search was proceeding, Harriman interviewed William Bruns. Suddenly, the normally stoic Bruns seemed shaken.
He broke down and started crying, and we thought, well, maybe we're going to begin to hear something here. And then he just reiterated, "I wouldn't hurt my Pearlie."
Now that the case had moved from missing persons to homicide, the detectives analyzed the dark brown stains found all over the Bruns home. Maybe not all of it was Pearl's. Perhaps it wasn't even blood. They didn't want to overlook any detail. At the State Crime Lab, forensics expert Ron Kaufman ran 2 tests. The first simple test would determine if the stains were actually blood. It proved positive. The second test would determine if the blood was human. He used an enzyme that reacts to human blood proteins. It reacted, proving the blood was human. but the lab couldn't determine if the blood was Pearl's.
We had no record of Mrs. Brunn's blood type. So eventually, we sent samples of the blood that we found on the suitcase, along with a blood sample from her daughter and the biological father of that daughter, to a private DNA laboratory, where they conducted what they call reverse paternity testing on the samples.
The reverse paternity test yielded a match. The blood came from Pearl Brunn's. The blood evidence gave the state police enough evidence for a warrant. They returned to Brunn's home and began looking for more blood, enough to indicate foul play. This time, they sprayed the entire house with luminol, a chemical that makes even the faintest residue of blood glow in the dark. Detectives were astounded by the results.
The whole area lit up bright green, the whole carpet, the wall. It was quite incredible. You could actually even see footsteps where someone had walked through the blood, and you could also see where someone had cleaned the carpet. You could see the motions back and forth where someone had attempted to clean it, and indeed had cleaned it by the naked eye, but the luminol could pick up the blood.
Detectives submitted the stains to the forensics lab. As they feared, it was Pearl's blood in fatal amounts. Detectives concluded that William Bruns had lied about more than cleaning his carpet. But to prove murder, they needed the body. Police believed that Pearl Bruns was murdered in her home, but they weren't at all certain they'd find the body there. Cadaver dogs couldn't pinpoint anything. Sergeant Mike Harriman knew they needed more drastic measures.
We had either the choice of removing the house from the foundation and digging that cellar with a backhoe, or finding an alternative means, which was ground-penetrating radar, to thoroughly scan that basement to see if there was a disturbance in that soil.
Ground-penetrating radar beams high-frequency radio waves into the earth. The reflected waves can detect anything from fuel tanks to power lines by revealing changes in the soil structure. Detectives turned to geophysicist Scott Culkin to conduct the search.
If you think of soil layers being laid down horizontally, they have a certain structure. And if that structure is compromised by a shovel, a backhoe, somebody digging, the soil structure, again, is destroyed.
If anyone had dug in the Bruns' cellar, GPR would reveal it. On the morning of September 11th, detectives returned with another warrant. The GPR made pass after pass across the dirt floor.
We have one depression.
About 90 minutes into the survey, the GPR detected an anomaly, a spot where the soil was disturbed.
We informed the Maine State Police of the presence of an anomalous area, and that anomalous area was approximately 5 feet by 18 inches wide, suggesting the presence of some sort of burial pit.
Something was down there. The digging began. After 5 minutes, police uncovered an oblong object wrapped in plastic and bound with a rope. It was a human body. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. On one arm, they found a wristwatch with a name engraved, Pearl Bruns. The examination showed the victim had been struck hard across the face. It was more than her frail body could bear.
She had a broken orbit of her eye, she had a broken cheekbone, broken nasal cannula. Pearl bled to death. If she had been given first aid or a rescue had been called to that home that day, she would have survived the injuries.
Confronted with the evidence, William Bruns pled guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years. Bruns never explained why he let his wife bleed to death without calling for help. Police know the couple was arguing, perhaps over Pearl's spending. The half-packed suitcase implied she was threatening to walk out. What is certain is the case assembled against William Bruns.
The forensics in this case was extremely important. I had done a considerable amount of legwork over the past year, and yet didn't have the tools that the state police actually had. The cadaver sniffing dog, the luminol, the access to the ground penetrating radar. All these tools made the discovery of Pearl's body possible. Without that, we could literally still be looking for her.
Time was, police had to produce a body to prove a murder. No more. Now, murder can be proven when the victim is merely presumed dead. Police investigating the disappearance of a woman in Iowa close in on a suspect. But to prove murder, they must identify a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. In Ohio, a grave is unearthed at a construction site. A makeshift coffin and human bones are all investigators have to lead them to a killer. An Illinois state trooper makes a gruesome discovery on the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from the unknown victim's teeth. Some killers believe that they have left no trace of themselves or their victims behind. But forensic scientists have found ways to decipher a killer's calling card by reading clues written in bone. Located on a bend on the Mississippi River, Davenport, Iowa is known as a quiet fishing community. But on March 18, 1983, police were visited by a concerned citizen named Marianne Roth. Marianne was worried about her friend Joyce Clint. They had spoken on the phone earlier in the morning and had made plans to spend the afternoon together. But Joyce hadn't shown up. Joyce had been under a lot of stress in recent weeks. Her marriage was in bad shape, and she and her husband, Jim, were considering divorce.
I don't think so.
Marianne described Joyce as a dedicated mother, not the type to simply run off without a word. For the sake of their son, Bart, Joyce had tried to keep the marriage together. But she wasn't naive. Marianne turned over a tape that Joyce had made several days before her disappearance.
2 days ago.
Joyce had planned to use it as evidence if the divorce went to trial. When investigators played the tape, they quickly realized that Joyce had secretly recorded an incriminating conversation between her and Jim. On it, she confronted her husband about money he was allegedly skimming from his chiropractic business. Responding to the threats, Jim told Joyce that if she exposed him, he would put her head under the pillow, smother her, and then cut her up into little pieces.
You're not going to touch that money. Do you understand?
Though it was savage talk, police are used to hearing these kinds of violent threats from couples facing divorce. To investigators, it was more likely that Joyce had decided to leave town.
Just a family quarrel.
With the tape safe at Marianne's, she could slip away until the divorce case went to trial. That theory was supported the following day. Joyce's friends discovered her car parked near the airport. Inside the vehicle, police found no evidence of a struggle or any signs of foul play. For investigators, everything suggested that Joyce had gone missing on purpose. Corporal Jerry McCabe of the Davenport Police Department worked the investigation.
It first looked like a possible family argument where she may have taken off and hadn't spoken to anybody in a while.
But the persistence of Joyce Clint's friends convinced police to look into the disappearance. They paid a visit to Jim Clint. Jim readily admitted that he and Joyce had fought on the morning of the 18th. He had stormed out and gone to the marina where he kept his boat in order to cool off. Because of rising floodwaters, he decided not to go out on the river. He secured his boat and returned home. By that time, he said Joyce was gone, along with a closet full of clothes and $4,000 of his money. Investigators checked on his alibi with a visit to the marina.
Did you see him on March 18th?
A restaurant manager confirmed that she saw Clint that morning, around 11 a.m. She saw Clint loading filled trash bags onto his boat. She said he left the dock in his boat, returned sometime later, and then went out again. This eyewitness account contradicted Jim's alibi. Detectives decided to take a closer look into Jim Clint's background. Jim Clint's drinking and philandering were well known in the small community of Davenport. Police learned that he had been having a blatant affair with one of his patients. Hoping to learn more, investigators tracked the woman down. She told investigators that on the day of Joyce's disappearance, Jim had invited her over around noon. He had a surprise. He said that Joyce agreed to a divorce and had left town. Now they could finally be together. Joyce's threats to expose Jim's alleged embezzling, coupled with the information about his extramarital affair, gave investigators reason to believe that Jim Clint had motive to kill his wife. But without any hard evidence that a crime had been committed, it was still just speculation. But on April 15th, nearly a month after Joyce's disappearance, the Mississippi River would offer a gruesome clue. Several miles south of Davenport, two fishermen noticed something floating in the river. As they got closer, they could see that it was the remains of something human. They fled the scene and called 911. Investigators responded to the riverbank and pulled the body from the water. It was a female torso, severed just above the navel and just below the tops of the thighs. For even the most seasoned detectives, the scene was difficult to comprehend. A limited autopsy determined that the victim was a Caucasian woman who'd been in the water anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. The cut marks appeared to have been made by a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain. Mindful of the violent threats Jim had made on the tape, investigators believed they had found Joyce Clint. But they were a long way from proving murder. To make their case, they would first have to identify the remains. and that wouldn't be easy. Investigators turned to renowned forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow at the University of Oklahoma. His approach is simple.
And basically what we try to do is look at the skeleton, all 200 bones and 32 teeth, and we're trying to answer two questions primarily. Who is this person? Who was this person? And how did they die?
Snow's expertise allows him to develop a profile from the barest of bones. Even with only the torso to work with, Snow could tell a lot about the victim. To determine her age, he studied the area of the pelvis known as the pubic symphysis.
The surfaces of this joint undergo some fairly regular changes with age. In younger people, there's a system of strong grooves, you might say, and ridges. They gradually begin to disappear in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so on, till finally you wind up with a rather flat, featureless surface.
Based on the ridge detail in the victim's pelvis, Snow believed the victim was between 26 and 34 years old. Next, he studied the dimensions of the remaining leg and hip bones and calculated that she was between 5 feet and 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed between 125 and 140 pounds. Even though Joyce Clint fit those measurements, police soon learned that so did dozens of other missing women. Until investigators could narrow down their pool of possible victims, the identity of the severed torso would remain a mystery. Police in Davenport, Iowa struggled with two cases: the disappearance of Joyce Clint and the discovery of a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. They believed the cases were connected, and they believed Joyce's husband, Jim, was responsible. But until they could positively identify the remains, they couldn't prove murder. Using the description of the victim supplied by forensic anthropologist Dr. Clyde Snow, Davenport Police Lieutenant Dennis Kern began a computerized search of all missing women in the region. The computer returned the names of 17 missing women. Detectives were able to eliminate 8 of the women since they had disappeared after the torso was found. 2 of the women were ultimately found, and another 3 didn't match the physical description.
When we were finished with 4 people, one of whom was Joyce Clint.
With the investigation taking on a more narrow focus, investigators decided to pay another visit to Jim Clint. They returned to his home, this time with a search warrant. In his garage, they found what they were looking for: a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain, the same width as the cut marks on the body. Technicians processed the chainsaw with indicator fluid that turns pink in the presence of blood. They covered every square inch of the saw. Not a single drop of blood or tissue could be found. Either Jim Clint was smarter than investigators had imagined, or the torso found in the river was not Joyce Clint. There was only one way to be sure. Police had to find a way to positively identify the remains. Though DNA analysis hadn't yet been developed in 1983, there were new ways of identifying an individual from genetic markers in blood enzymes. Blood samples were subpoenaed from Jim Clint and his son Bart. A comparison with the blood from the victim showed a genetic consistency with Bart. Further tests of Joyce Clint's parents' blood also showed consistent patterns. The genetic information on its own was not enough to establish identity. But out of the 4 unaccounted-for women, only Joyce Clint matched both the physical description as described by Dr. Snow and the genetic description provided by the blood tests. The conclusion was unmistakable.
Looking at the women that met these physical characteristics, what of those 4, what were the odds that any one of them would have matched the genetic picture? And the odds were infinitesimal.
The torso belonged to Joyce Clint. And all of the evidence pointed to her husband Jim as the killer.
There was a division of monies, properties, and that he was going to lose. He was going to have a lot of things taken away from him because she was done, fed up, ready to go. And the girlfriend motive was there. There were so many that he thought that were in his way of a happier life, you know.
Jim was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. Police believe that Jim executed his plan on the morning of March 18th. After murdering Joyce in their home, he drove her remains to a remote spot where he dismembered her with a chainsaw. He used his boat to dispose of the body parts and the saw. He then placed her car near the airport to throw investigators off his trail. Though he maintained his innocence through the trial, the jury found Jim Clint guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Jim Clint thought that dismemberment would keep himself and his victim from ever being identified. In Ohio, a killer tried to avoid prosecution by keeping his horrible secret buried deep in the ground. On June 20th, 1990, in the small northern Ohio town of Elyria, a construction worker uncovered a long-buried secret. His bulldozer struck a hard object, resting several feet beneath the ground. It appeared to be a wooden box. As he walked closer to the find, he was overwhelmed by a horrible odor. He realized he had unearthed a makeshift grave. He called police. Lieutenant Dan Jekyll of the Elyria Police Department was immediately dispatched to the site. Due to the construction, the scene had already been compromised.
But we were concerned about the evidence. The evidence was being pushed down by the bulldozer. There were bits of pieces and wood that might have been carried 25, 30, 40 yards away, besides the initial scene that we had to protect.
That wasn't their only problem. Rain clouds threatened to destroy possible trace evidence. With the site now exposed, they would only have this one chance to get what they needed. To preserve any potential findings, investigators had to treat the scene like an archaeological dig, sifting through the earth for stray bullets, jewelry, or other identification with deliberate precision. The initial search of the construction site turned up no clues to tell investigators the identity of the victim. After several hours, the badly decomposed body, wrapped in garbage bags, was hand dug from the grave. Despite their continued efforts, no additional evidence or identification was found. Police needed to know who was in the grave before they could figure out how he or she got there. For help, investigators called on distinguished anthropology professor Dr. Owen Lovejoy at Kent State University.
I went out and examined the body and collected some materials, the purpose of which was to provide as many details about that individual in life as I could.
From the condition of the pelvis, examiners were able to determine that the body was a female, somewhere around 28 to 30 years old. An examination into the shape and proportions of the skull told them that the victim was Caucasian. Dr. Lovejoy measured the thigh and arm bones and factored them into an equation to determine the victim's height. She was surprisingly tall, almost 6 feet. Dr. Lovejoy had provided investigators with their first glimpse of how the victim appeared alive. It was now up to them to discover her identity. Detectives started by looking into unsolved missing persons cases. But in all of those cases, none of the missing women fit the description of the buried body. Investigators turned their attention to the only other piece of evidence. Though it seemed like a long shot, they called in a draftsman to measure the fractured pieces of the makeshift coffin and render a detailed illustration of it. Investigators turned the illustration over to the local paper, along with the description of the unidentified woman. Days later, a woman called to say that she thought she recognized the makeshift coffin. The woman remembered admiring the piece in her friend Sandra Stuller's apartment.
Again, we talked on the phone.
She told police it had been over 3 years since Sandra disappeared without a goodbye. She wasn't able to offer any speculation on what happened to her old friend, but she was able to give police a valuable piece of information. Like the woman found at the construction site, Sandra Stuller was 6 feet tall. Though still unsure that they'd identified their victim, it was the investigators' only lead. Detectives tracked down an aunt and uncle of Sandra's living in the area. Like the witness who identified the chest, they hadn't seen their niece in the past 3 years. The relatives said that shortly before they lost touch, Sandra had rekindled a relationship with her ex-husband, Doug Hartman. He had been a loving and supportive husband at first, but as the years went by, he grew abusive. Sandra eventually left him, but Doug wanted her back, and against the wishes of her relatives, she decided to give him another chance.
And the family told Sandra, this is a bad move. You should not go back to Douglas Hartman. In fact, if you decide to do that, you're no longer part of this family.
But Sandra stuck with Doug, and the family severed ties.
Well, I appreciate it. If you hear from her...
They hadn't heard from her since. Now, investigators needed to pick up the story where the aunt and uncle's account left off. They tracked down the manager of Sandra's last known apartment, where she lived just before she disappeared in 1987.
She had paid rent in full. But
Apparently, the reunion with Doug had been short-lived. Sandra had been living alone at the time.
and she wasn't there.
The manager remembered that the circumstances surrounding Sandra's departure were strange. In December of 1987, she saw a man moving Sandra's belongings out of the apartment and into a rental truck. The manager had not seen the man before. She didn't see Sandra that day or ever again. Sandra had abandoned her apartment without a word. Investigators suspected the man moving Sandra's things was Doug Hartman. To prove that theory, they went to the truck rental agency. They pored over hundreds of receipts from 3 years before.
That's it.
On one of the receipts from December of 1987, they found what they came for.
Do you happen to remember anything about this gentleman?
The name of Sandra's ex-husband, Doug Hartman.
Okay. I appreciate it.
It was time to question Doug, but there was no record of him living in town. But detectives managed to find a relative still in the area. He told police he hadn't heard from Doug since he had gone to live with his grandmother in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a few years back. Detectives wondered what had prompted Doug to leave town.
And if you hear from him or if you think of anything else.
But their theories would be meaningless until they could prove that the buried remains belonged to Sandra Stuller. Detectives in Elyria, Ohio, believed that the body and the makeshift coffin unearthed at a construction site belonged to Sandra Stuller. And they suspected that her ex-husband, Doug Hartman, had put her there. Word of the investigation into Sandra Stuller's whereabouts spread quickly. A local bank manager contacted detectives. He too had been searching for Sandra. She had stopped paying rent on a security deposit box. Investigators obtained a search warrant. The contents of the box included Sandra's divorce decree, her will, and some diamond and gold jewelry. Not the kind of valuable items a person would carelessly abandon, unless, as Detective Dan Jekyll thought, they had no choice.
And that reinforced my idea that the person that we uncovered on Shadden Road was in fact Sandra Stuller, but I had to prove it.
Detectives were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. Desperate for any information, they plugged Sandra's Social Security number into a law enforcement database. They got a hit. Sandra had been in a car accident shortly before she disappeared. The report mentioned that she had been taken to the hospital for treatment, which included X-rays. It was the break detectives were looking for.
When I found out that there was a chest X-ray taken, I knew that this would help the case. And when I contacted Dr. Lovejoy, he told me if I can get that original X-ray, there's a real good chance that he could identify the remains.
Investigators visited the hospital and subpoenaed Sandra Stuller's X-rays. Now that they had a source of comparison, they turned back to the expertise of forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Lovejoy.
Initially, when we looked at her skeleton and compared it to these chest films, we realized that there were a number of very special characters that were very rare. One of these was the fact that she only had 11 ribs, when a normal individual usually has 12. That's a fairly rare abnormality. Another is that the individual had suffered a fracture of her right clavicle. And so these were two characters that matched both the bones that we had.
It was powerful evidence, but not conclusive. Lovejoy next had to examine the very fine details preserved inside the bone. There, small features called trabecula are as unique as the characteristics of a fingerprint. To make the comparison, Dr. Lovejoy began by re-X-raying the bones with a powerful machine called a faxitron that produces high-resolution images of bone. That completed, he then compared the trabecula one by one.
We did this in this particular case and found that they were in fact an exact match, so that there was no question that these were the remains of Sandra Stoller.
The victim had finally been identified. Investigators now needed to establish and prove motive in her death. Looking through her financial records, they believed they found their answer. Prior to her disappearance, Sandra had inherited over $100,000 when her mother died. She had set up a $50,000 mutual fund and had been living off the interest. But a letter in the file, signed by Sandra after she had already been murdered, requested that her assets be transferred to an account in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That account was in the name of Doug Hartman. Sandra Stoller had been murdered for her money.
And through bank records and subpoenas, I was able to track that $51,000 into Douglas Hartman's own personal checking account. I did have a motive then.
Doug was brought back to Ohio for questioning. When investigators confronted him with all of the evidence, he began to crumble. He confessed to killing her, but claimed that it had been an accident. Police believed otherwise. After murdering Sandra and burying her body, Doug fled to Virginia, where he had all of her assets transferred into his bank account. It took a jury less than 6 hours to find Doug Hartman guilty of aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and theft. He was sentenced to life in prison. Though Sandra Stoller's body had been buried for more than 3 years, investigators were able to solve her murder from the bare bones. In Illinois, investigators had even less to work with. Stretching from Chicago to Springfield, I-55 is one of the most heavily traveled highways in Illinois. State troopers regularly cruise its length, hunting down speeders. But on March 10, 1986, it was not a speeder that caught the troopers' attention. Something was burning on the side of the road. As the officer approached, he thought it was a mannequin that had been set on fire. But as he got closer, he realized it was something far more disturbing. It was the charred mass of a human body. After extinguishing the blaze, the trooper called for backup. The following morning, evidence technicians from the Illinois Division of Criminal Investigations began processing the area for clues. The scene offered little indication as to who could have committed this brutal act. The only potential evidence was a set of tire tracks imprinted in the soil. But on a well-traveled highway, they could have belonged to anyone. Technicians made a plaster mold of the tread marks in the hopes a suspect would emerge and could then be placed at the scene. But finding a suspect would be difficult, if not impossible, until detectives could identify the remains. At autopsy, the examiner concluded the female victim had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The only identifying features that survived the fire were her teeth. A pearl necklace and a ring bearing the letter E were removed from the victim. Based on her petite stature and slender hip dimensions, the examiner believed the victim to be between 18 and 25 years old and possibly Hispanic. For Lieutenant Carlos Hevia of the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations, the information wasn't a lot to go on.
The first order of business is identify who's the victim. In this particular case, we had difficulty because of the fact that we didn't have a photograph to go around when we were doing canvassing.
Nonetheless, investigators began questioning people in the neighborhoods around the scene of the fire. One clerk at a nearby gas station remembered selling a can of gasoline the night before. He helped investigators come up with a composite. The sketch was publicized, but no one came forward to name the suspect. Investigators launched a statewide media campaign. A flood of tips came in, but after 2 weeks, detectives still couldn't match the remains to any missing persons cases. With their whole case hinging on identification, investigators sought help from the state's Forensic Anthropology Department. After taking a life-sized X-ray of the victim's skull, they built a three-dimensional model, sculpting a face in modeling clay. It might not be an identical match, but hopefully it would bring about a spark of recognition from the public. Photographs of the reconstructed head and the victim's ring were sent to local press. But again, no one came forward to identify the young woman. Now, several weeks after the murder, chances of solving the case were dwindling away. A methodical killer still walked the streets. After several weeks, investigators were no closer to solving the brutal murder of an unidentified woman whose body had been set on fire and left burning on the side of an Illinois highway. Desperate to identify the remains, investigators sent the victim's skull and teeth to Dr. Stephen Smith, a consultant in forensic dentistry.
In the worst of circumstances, the teeth pretty well survive. And so because of that, we become very useful for the uniqueness of the human dentition. We can find the uniquenesses that everybody has in their dentition. And that's enough to separate us from one human being to another.
The arch of the jaw suggested that the victim was most likely Asian, not Hispanic. After studying the general anatomy, Dr. Smith examined each individual tooth.
This would be the temporary cement that would indicate that this person is probably going to be going back to the dentist. And I see some bone loss in this area, This would indicate periodontal disease, and that the person probably was possibly seeing a periodontist.
This kind of dental history gave Dr. Smith new insight into the victim's age.
As I looked at this information and as I came to my independent evaluation, I thought this person had to be at least in their 40s. 38 to 40, maybe 42, 43, somewhere like that, but not more than a 5-year difference.
Dr. Smith's detailed analysis had exposed a critical flaw in the original description of the victim. She couldn't have been between the ages of 18 and 25 as previously thought. He showed that she was some 20 years older than that.
In this particular case, we were scrambling because we were chasing an 18 to 25-year-old missing person that was not our victim. So when they came up with that, it was like somebody just opened a door, you know.
Now, almost 2 months after the burning body had been found, detectives went back to the statewide police computer network and modified the victim's description. The new findings paid off. Within hours of modifying their search, investigators received a call from nearby DuPage County Sheriff's Department. They had a missing persons case that matched the new description. Illinois State Police met with DuPage County Sheriffs to discuss the case. They learned Erlinda Anderson was a 43-year-old housewife reported missing by her sister in early March. Born in the Philippines, she'd come to the United States to marry her husband, William. The fact that this victim's name began with the letter E led investigators to believe they were on the right track.
All right, thanks very much.
Deputies told investigators that they had met with William Anderson shortly after his wife was reported missing. He was questioned about his wife and their marriage. It hadn't been a traditional courtship.
Missy, who said that?
During the interview, Anderson admitted that he'd met Erlinda through a classified ad. She was looking for an American husband. He was looking for companionship. The relationship started well, Anderson said. She seemed very happy with the comforts of middle-class America. But as the marriage wore on, Erlinda became very homesick. He insisted Erlinda wasn't missing. In fact, he'd seen her board a plane bound for the Philippines in early March. Following up on William Anderson's story, DuPage County investigators questioned Erlinda's friends. They confirmed that Erlinda had been unhappy with her life in the U.S., mostly because of her marriage to William. And she had been longing to return home. But it was strange that they hadn't heard from their friend in months. William Anderson's inconsistent story, coupled with Dr. Smith's forensic analysis, led investigators to now believe the victim found burning on the side of the road was Erlinda Anderson. And that would make her husband the leading suspect in her murder. But so far, there was no evidence to prove it. Investigators from the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations were getting closer to identifying charred remains found along a highway. They believed the victim was 43-year-old Erlinda Anderson. But until they could be sure, police wouldn't be able to make a case against the prime suspect, her husband, William. With only the victim's teeth to work with, investigators subpoenaed Erlinda's dental records.
Great.
They were sent to forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith for comparison. While awaiting the results of his examination, detectives began scrutinizing William Anderson's alibi. He had claimed that he had seen Erlinda board a plane bound for the Philippines. Investigators paid a visit to the airlines. Anderson had in fact purchased a ticket to Manila in Erlinda's name. But a week before her body was found, records showed that William Anderson cashed in the ticket. Erlinda never boarded a plane to the Philippines. William Anderson had been caught in a blatant lie. But if Anderson had killed his wife, the question now before investigators was why? A further background check revealed that Erlinda had been William's 5th wife. Based on a search of Anderson's phone records, they learned that he probably didn't intend her to be his last. Many of the bills reflected calls to one of Anderson's female co-workers. The woman, who was married, reluctantly admitted that she and Anderson had been having an affair. Anderson complained to her that Erlinda was constantly spending his money, always sending gifts to her friends and family in the Philippines. The day after the body was found, William took her out for a romantic dinner. He told her to leave her husband and marry him instead.
She questioned Anderson about, well, you know, what about your wife? And Anderson told her, don't worry about my wife, she's not coming back.
The case was now in the hands of forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith. When making an identification, Smith superimposes the living dental records with the x-rays made after death.
On this case here, I can take and move it around, and all of a sudden I see a clear picture. It was fuzzy, now it's totally clear. It means that the one film overlays the other one perfectly. In myself, if I'm asked, is this a match, I could say yes. I would be assured, looking at this film, that this film matches that film, and I could say that this dentition belongs to that remains.
After months of frustration, the burned body had finally been identified as Erlinda Anderson. And with a new romance brewing, William Anderson had motive to get rid of her. Still lacking physical evidence linking him to the murder, investigators paid him another visit. They asked him to follow them to the police station for further questioning. While police began their interrogation, a warrant was obtained to search Anderson's car. Though the tire treads did not match those found at the crime scene, the trunk and the items inside it were splattered with red stains.
I have something in here.
Indicator tests confirmed the presence of human blood on a windbreaker and a tire iron. The blood was too deteriorated to make a detailed comparison, but it was one more piece of incriminating evidence. The results of the examination were brought up to police. William Anderson was placed under arrest. Investigators believe that Anderson used the tire iron to beat Erlinda in the head. After she was dead, he drove her body down Interstate 55. He doused her body in gasoline, thinking that all his problems would burn away in the ensuing fire. Without the insights of forensic dentistry, he might have gotten away without a trace. A jury found William Anderson guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Some killers are determined to keep the identity of their victims a secret. When they are successful, their deeds threaten to go unpunished. But forensic scientists can breathe life into a dying investigation and find justice written in bone. A teenage girl is found murdered in her Indiana home. And police soon suspect that she is not this killer's only victim. Detectives race the clock to track a serial killer across the country before he strikes again. Someone is targeting elderly women in a gated California community. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to find a link between the murders. For homicide investigators, it's difficult to predict when and where a serial killer will strike next. But with the help of forensic examiners, they can isolate tiny clues that can lead them to the killer who is driven by bloodlust. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. An hour's drive south of Chicago, Griffith, Indiana is home to 18,000 people. People drawn here by the quiet lifestyle and the low crime rate.
Hey, Wendy.
Around 7 p.m. on October 13th, 1987, 15-year-old Christine Gallagher returned home from school.
I believe what happened at the swim meet today.
She called out to her older sister, Wendy, but there was no response.
Hey, Wendy.
Though Mrs. Gallagher was still at work, Wendy should have been home from school hours ago. Christine checked the bedroom.
Oh my God, Wendy.
There, she found 16-year-old Wendy's lifeless body on the floor. Griffith police and crime scene units were immediately dispatched to the Gallagher apartment. The distraught teenager was taken to a squad car as police made their way into the residence. Inside the apartment, the living room was neat and orderly. But in the bedroom, police discovered the gruesome scene. The semi-nude victim had been gagged, her hands tied behind her back with a bedsheet. She'd been stabbed repeatedly. It appeared that she had been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was recovered. For Lieutenant John Mowry of the Griffith Police Department, the scene was difficult to comprehend.
When I walked into that apartment and saw the victim, Wendy Gallagher, and saw the savage manner in which she had been killed, I've never seen anything like that. I was on the department 17 years prior to that, have investigated other homicides. I've never seen anything that even comes descriptively close to the way that scene was.
Investigators began to methodically process the scene. Next to the window, they discovered blood spatter on the wall and curtain. Hoping to find prints, they treated the wall with silver nitrate, a chemical that reacts to the oils found in fingers and palms. Then they scanned the area with a light source. A partial palm print and more blood spatter emerged. The section of wall was removed and forwarded to the crime lab. In the living room, investigators collected a drinking glass with smudged fingerprints. They also found a denim jacket hanging on the back of a chair. Searching the pockets, they found a driver's license. It belonged to a teenage boy with a local address.
Run a check on that part.
On the kitchen counter, detectives recovered a woman's purse. There was no identification inside. Outside, Christine told police that her father had dropped her off after a school swim meet. She said that since their parents' recent divorce, she and Wendy would sometimes be by themselves after school until Mrs. Gallagher returned from work soon after. As Christine continued answering questions, one of the investigators brought out the purse found in the kitchen.
Let me show you something. See if you know whose it is.
Christine said it was hers. She added that when she arrived home, she didn't remember seeing Wendy's purse anywhere. Then, Mrs. Gallagher returned from work and learned about the murder. Overwhelmed with grief, she told police she couldn't believe anyone would want to kill her daughter. Wendy was such a beautiful and cheerful girl. When shown the ID from the denim jacket, the Gallaghers recognized the boy immediately. He was Wendy's boyfriend. Looking for any clue to the killer's identity, examiners at the Lake County Crime Lab began to analyze the prints recovered from the Gallagher apartment. They started with the smudged drinking glass. When dusted with black powder, two distinct sets of fingerprints were revealed. Analysis of the arches, whorls, and loops that makes each print unique established that one set was Wendy's. But the second set of prints didn't match any of the Gallaghers. Next, examiners turned to the section of wall removed from Wendy's bedroom. To preserve the fragile drywall, they worked from photographs. Again, the partial palm print didn't match samples taken from any of the Gallaghers. Its position on the drywall in relation to the blood found around the window led evidence technician Ronald Latch to conclude that whoever left it had been startled.
He put one hand on the wall and looked out the curtain because you could see blood on the edge of the curtain and on the wall, and looking out to see if somebody was coming. Maybe he heard a voice or a car door slam.
But the concern must have been short-lived. Crime scene analysis uncovered no signs of a forced entry or exit. It appeared that after committing this brutal murder, the killer calmly left the apartment, probably through the front door. Convinced that the unidentified prints were the key to revealing the killer's identity, investigators ran them through APHIS, a computer database that holds millions of fingerprint records. but no matches were found. Detectives turned to Wendy's boyfriend for answers. They wanted to know why his jacket and ID were found in the Gallagher's apartment.
Come in today, an e-card.
In my coat pocket.
The teenager explained that Wendy had been cold that day at school. He'd loaned her his jacket and she'd worn it home.
At your girlfriend's house.
He said he was home with his parents during the time of the murder.
Walking home from school when she was cold, so I took it off and let her have it.
He also told police he had no idea who could have hurt Wendy. She was very popular at school, where she was an honor student and a pom-pom girl.
Okay, so Ryan.
He said Wendy was a lot of fun to be with, and he couldn't believe she was gone.
I was in the back of the class.
I'm going to go get this folder up.
Though he had a solid alibi, detectives fingerprinted him before letting him go. But analysis of his prints later confirmed his innocence. Police spent the next several days interviewing dozens of Wendy's friends and neighbors. Over 50 potential suspects were developed, but fingerprint analysis eliminated all of them.
Or clothing that was...
According to Detective Carl Grimmer, tensions in the small town grew as the investigation hit a dead end.
And there's the top of their...
Within the community of Griffith after this occurred, there was a lot of fear. We didn't know who we were looking for. We didn't know if we were looking for somebody that lived in our town, somebody in a neighboring town, or if it could have been a drifter.
Let's see here, Ms. Laird.
But a week after the murder, police got a solid lead. A woman in Chicago had found Wendy's missing purse.
I understand you found a purse that we were been looking for.
The purse somehow ended up in my purse. I had
She explained that her own purse had been snatched during an assault.
The purse actually ended up in mine. Yes, sir.
When it was later recovered from a dumpster and returned, she opened it and found Wendy Gallagher's purse and ID stuffed inside. Then she'd heard about the murder in Griffith.
I was walking home down an alley and this car pulls up.
The woman said that as she left work through the back door, a man with brown hair and a mustache jumped out of a blue car. He grabbed her and threatened her with a knife. As they struggled, a delivery truck pulled up. Panicked, the assailant grabbed her purse and fled. But he had left behind valuable evidence. A witness who could identify him and a physical link to Wendy's murder.
I can recall he had, I guess, brown hair.
Police quickly released a composite sketch of the suspect, along with a description of his blue car. Over the next several weeks, they received many leads as a result, but none of them panned out. Despite the lack of progress, investigators refused to give up.
Everybody who had walked into that crime scene that night and saw Wendy, that's all the incentive you needed to keep going, to find out who had done that to her.
Griffith detectives had a composite sketch and fingerprints that could prove murder. But until they could identify their suspect, that evidence was meaningless.
Not even the color of any uniforms. The only thing
And all indications suggested that Wendy Gallagher was not going to be this killer's last victim.
The victim from Chicago is the one.
Several months had passed with little progress in the murder case of 16-year-old Wendy Gallagher. Though Griffith, Indiana police had a composite drawing of their suspect and prints recovered from the murder scene, his identity and his whereabouts remained unknown.
Detective Grimmer.
As they struggled to keep the case alive, an improbable lead was called in by police in Pasco County, Florida, located more than 1,100 miles away from Griffith, Indiana.
That's correct. Yes, method of operation.
While investigating the homicide of a 14-year-old girl there, Florida police believed that a resident had uncovered a connection to Wendy Gallagher's unsolved murder.
Who's your lead detective on this case?
That resident, Diane Collins, had just moved to Pasco County from Griffith, Indiana. As details of the Florida murder were made public, Diane immediately noticed similarities to the homicide in Griffith. The frighteningly familiar details compelled her to contact the police.
I was very much struck by the fact that this was another young teenage girl who was murdered in her home after school hours, just as Wendy was in the community I had just left.
Griffith police were skeptical that such a tenuous lead could impact their case, but they had little else to go on. They asked Pasco County investigators to forward the case files. According to police reports, in January 1988, 14-year-old Janet Clark was discovered in her bedroom by her younger brother shortly after 6 p.m. He and Mr. Clark had just returned home from running an errand. Janet had been home from school just a few hours. When police arrived, they found Janet's partially clad body gagged and bound, her hands tied together with a bed sheet. She'd been viciously knifed and raped. No prints had been found at the scene. And while DNA evidence was recovered during autopsy, investigators had no suspect to link it to. But now, Griffith detective Carl Grimmer realized that Diane Collins' instincts might have been dead on.
We thought it was a long shot that the two cases could be connected. But when we sat and studied the photos, studied the crime scenes, we became stronger and stronger in our belief that they probably were connected. It's just, you had to see it to see the similarities. It's almost like there was a signature.
Believing they were now searching for the same killer, the two departments began exchanging information. Pasco County, Florida police intensified their investigation. One of the Clark's neighbors recalled a man in the neighborhood around the time of Janet's murder. She had never seen him before. She described the man to a police sketch artist as being in his late 20s, with dark hair and a mustache. She believed that he was driving a late model red Corvette with Missouri license plates. Though the description of the vehicle was different, Griffith police couldn't ignore the striking similarities to their suspect. For Detective Mowry, there was little doubt that a serial killer was on the loose.
Time definitely was our enemy. We knew from what we had seen thus far how savage this person was. So we were virtually racing against the clock. We wanted to apprehend him as quickly as we could to prevent him from hurting anybody else.
But police knew that tracking a multi-state killer would be difficult. Until he struck again, all they could do was wait. And they feared this killer wouldn't make them wait very long. Two months later, police in Beaumont, Texas responded to reports of gunfire at a local motel. Responding officers burst into the room where the shots had been heard. There, they discovered one of their own, Officer Paul Halsey, unconscious, the victim of a gunshot wound. The fallen officer had notified dispatch just a few minutes before that he was checking on the driver of a stolen vehicle who had just entered one of the rooms. Officer Halsey was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries proved fatal. He died a short while later. A witness at the motel stated that he heard gunfire and looked out his window. he saw a man with dark hair and a mustache speed away in a red Corvette. An all-points bulletin was issued for the red sports car. And within a few minutes, dispatchers reported that the vehicle had been spotted. The sports car was able to elude police for more than 20 miles. But the driver suddenly lost control and the car swerved off the road. He fled into a wooded area on foot and disappeared. Texas authorities began preparing their manhunt for a suspected cop killer. While police in Indiana and Florida struggled to track down a serial killer who preyed upon young girls, police 2,000 miles away in Beaumont, Texas, were on the trail of a suspected cop killer. Though the suspect had managed to escape, police had his abandoned red Corvette.
How you doing? All right.
Inside, they recovered a blood-stained .357 Magnum that had been recently fired.
357?
They also found stolen license plates, including a set from Missouri. Now their focus was on finding the driver. Detective Ray Beck of the Beaumont Police Department organized the manhunt.
The word was out, so we had officers coming in from everywhere, just volunteering their time, their effort, so manpower was unbelievable.
Through witnesses, police learned that the suspect had jumped into a taxi and was headed toward Houston. Officers quickly caught up with the cab.
Taxi drivers, get out of the car! Backseat passenger, get your hands up!
The man believed responsible for the murder of Officer Halsey was taken into custody.
Get your hands up, get out of the car. Get your hands where I can see them. Turn around, put me on the trunk.
The suspect, identified as 28-year-old Michael Lee Lockhart, was questioned at the Beaumont police station. He immediately confessed to shooting Officer Halsey, but offered no explanation. It seemed too easy. Robert Hobbs, an investigator with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, recalls Lockhart's interview.
He was very calm, he was very collected. We knew right away that we were that this was not our typical criminal in Southeast Texas, and that we would have our work cut out for us.
Their instincts told them Lockhart wouldn't have killed a police officer over a stolen car. There had to be more, a lot more, to this murder.
What we're going to do is take some fingerprints of you.
Investigators fingerprinted Lockhart and collected hair samples. He was held without bond on capital murder charges. Ballistics results, bolstered by Lockhart's confession, gave Beaumont detectives an airtight case. But Lockhart's quick confession still seemed too calculated, as if he might be trying to head off further investigation. Evidence recovered from Lockhart's motel room indicated he'd been on the move for months. Police had recovered several hotel and restaurant receipts from throughout the Midwest. But what was he running from? Hoping to find out, Detective Ray Beck wrote an article profiling Lockhart and details of Officer Halsey's murder for a national law enforcement magazine. The tactic paid off. A detective working the Janet Clark murder in Pasco County, Florida, read the article on Lockhart and Officer Halsey's murder. He then called the Beaumont Police Department. Detective Beck quickly understood why.
One of the missing links to their case was the fact that their red Corvette had Missouri license plates. And that was one of the pieces of evidence that we had here, was Missouri license plates that we found in the Corvette.
Detective Beck next learned about the connection to Wendy Gallagher's murder. Investigators working that case in Griffith, Indiana, were immediately notified. They requested that Lockhart's prints be forwarded to the Lake County Crime Lab. Hoping they had the evidence they needed to prove murder, examiners went to work, comparing Lockhart's fingerprints to those recovered from the Wendy Gallagher crime scene. After scrutinizing and comparing both sets of prints, examiner Ronald Latch was certain that Wendy's killer had been found.
The fingerprints we found at the scene put Michael Lee Lockhart in that apartment, and the palm prints put him right next to the body of the victim, where there was blood and on the curtain in the wall.
Nearly 8 months after Wendy Gallagher was found murdered in her home, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to charge Michael Lee Lockhart with her murder.
I felt a great sense of relief because I knew that he couldn't commit any more crimes. And I also felt happy that we would be able to contribute and help bring some semblance of closure to the Gallagher family.
On June 30th, 1988, DNA analysis confirmed that Lockhart had murdered and sexually assaulted Janet Clark in Florida. Working together, 3 police agencies had tied 3 seemingly unrelated murders to one predator. Based on the evidence, police believe that Lockhart traveled the country in search of his next victim.
Hey, those are right down the road. Can I use your
He would prowl an area, hunting for vulnerable young victims. When he knew they were alone, he would con his way into their homes, where he would rape and murder them. Michael Lee Lockhart stood trial for murder in all 3 states. He was sentenced to death in each trial. In Texas, on December 9, 1997, Michael Lee Lockhart was executed for his crimes. It took the cooperative effort of 3 police departments to track a transient serial killer across the United States.
He's talking to.
But sometimes, murderers who stay in one place are just as hard for investigators to find. 75 miles from Los Angeles, Riverside County, California is a haven for retirees and people looking to escape the problems of urban life. But on February 16, 1994, a 911 call brought police from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office to a condo in the upscale community of Canyon Lake. There, investigators found the body of 86-year-old Norma Davis slumped in an easy chair. A phone cord was wrapped around her throat, and knives protruded from her chest and neck. Investigators began searching the scene, looking for anything that could tell them who had murdered Norma Davis and why. Robbery appeared to be an unlikely motive. The victim still wore an expensive ring on her finger.
As expensive as that ring is,
A few desk drawers were open, but there were no signs of ransacking. Forensic technicians processed the body, looking for any stray hairs or fibers that the killer may have left behind. But from the position of the body, it was clear to California Department of Justice criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson that there was little interaction between the victim and killer.
She appeared to just be sitting in her chair as if she were perhaps reading or watching TV. It didn't appear that she had made much of a struggle or had attempted to get up from that chair.
That told investigators that Norma Davis most likely knew her killer. The knives were removed and sent to the crime lab to be tested for prints. A search of the condo confirmed that robbery was not a motive. On the kitchen floor, investigators found Norma's purse, still containing credit cards and cash. In the hallway, investigators spotted a faint shoe print on the floor. To get a better look, the room was darkened. Closer examination revealed that it was a sneaker print left in dust. And recovering such fragile evidence would be tricky. But in a crime scene that yielded few clues to the killer's identity, the print could prove to be a vital piece of evidence. After thoroughly photographing the print, technicians carefully applied an adhesive gelatin to lift it. But the minute details of the print didn't survive the lift. It would be up to examiners to determine if there was a sufficient sample to do future comparisons when and if a suspect emerged. Outside, detectives talked to Alice Williams, who had found the victim. She stated that she had come over to pick up Norma for their weekly hair appointment. She let herself in when Norma didn't respond to her calls. That's when she discovered the body. She couldn't understand how such a thing could have happened in Canyon Lake. It was a gated community with round-the-clock security.
You have a mustache?
Norma's ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, had also arrived at the scene. She too lived in Canyon Lake. She told investigators that she and Norma were very close. But as Mary continued describing Norma in greater detail, detectives glanced down and noticed she was wearing Nike sneakers. They asked if there was anyone close to Norma who would want her dead. Mary reacted with shock, insisting no relative could possibly be involved. But now, detectives weren't so sure. They turned to the crime lab for answers. But criminalists at the California Department of Justice Forensic Lab determined that all of the evidence recovered from the condo had been wiped clean of prints.
One of those stains could have come from her. There were no stains.
They hoped the recovered shoe print could lead them to Norma's killer. For Ricky Eldon Cooksey, a criminalist with the Department of Justice Crime Lab in Riverside, shoe print evidence can carry investigators a long way.
A shoe print collected at the crime scene can help the investigators if we can identify what kind of shoe made that print, and there are data banks that store that type of information. We can tell them what type of shoe they're looking for and size shoe they're looking for.
After reviewing hundreds of different sneaker tread designs, Cooksey believed that the print recovered from Norma Davis's home had been made by a Nike. He acquired a similar sneaker from the manufacturer and made test prints. The tread design was identical. Cooksey had determined that the suspect's print had been made by a size 6.5 Nike Air tennis shoe. For detectives, the news was not that encouraging.
Talk to you later. Okay.
Tracking down a specific purchase of such a popular shoe would be next to impossible.
Thank you.
The only thing that homicide detective Joe Greco could infer from the analysis was that the suspect was a small male or possibly a woman. And he already had a potential suspect who fit that description.
Goodbye. We suspected the ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, because of the shoes that she was wearing when she came to the crime scene, and the brand of shoe matched the brand of shoe that we found in the doorway. And also she was the caretaker. She was the obvious choice.
Thanks, Jerry.
Police questioned Mary Pierce in greater detail, carefully watching her demeanor.
She would take her medicine.
Mary said her ex-mother-in-law was a wonderful, warm person who didn't have any enemies. Most days she just watched her TV or read.
She was just a real
After
sweet
answering
old lady.
dozens of
She really
questions,
was.
it became clear to investigators that Mary was not involved in Norma's murder.
Okay, I sure will.
Her cooperation and her grief were sincere.
Please call me.
Okay, thank you. I sure will.
I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Thank you.
Detectives reviewed dozens of statements given by Norma's family, friends, and neighbors, but no one had any useful information. The case quickly threatened to go cold. With no suspects and no solid leads, it looked like Norma Davis's murder might never be solved. In Riverside, California, the investigation into the stabbing and strangulation death of 86-year-old Norma Davis, killed in her Canyon Lake home, had ground to a halt.
Attention units, we have a possible homicide.
As investigators struggled to keep the case alive, another 911 call came in from residents of Canyon Lake. Another elderly woman had been found murdered in her home. There, police discovered 66-year-old June Roberts, dead on her office floor. And for everyone in the room, this crime scene looked disturbingly familiar. Though June Roberts had not been stabbed, she still wore an expensive ring and had a phone cord wrapped around her neck. Credit cards were scattered around her purse, but nothing appeared to be missing. For criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson, it was obvious that June Roberts and Norma Davis's murders were connected.
The type of crimes, both brutal homicides occurring within a few short days of between each other in this area, led us to think that these two crimes may be linked.
Investigators scoured the home. A Bible caught detectives' attention. Inside was a handwritten prayer list. Norma Davis's name was on that list. The two victims were friends. But for Detective Greco, how they were connected to the killer was unclear. He could be certain about one thing, however. A serial killer was targeting elderly women in Canyon Lake.
This whole case is overwhelming in that it's not something that one in law enforcement comes across every day. It's a crime of serious violence, and it wasn't stopping. I mean, it was just the beginning.
And so far, this killer had made few mistakes. But a week after June Roberts' death, that all seemed to change. June Roberts' daughter brought police a statement from one of her mother's credit card companies. Someone had gone on a spending spree immediately after June's death, charging jewelry, clothing, and other merchandise. It was the break detectives were waiting for. Now they had a paper trail to follow. They started at a jewelry store, where the first purchase with the murdered victim's card had been made.
Detective Greco from the Riverside County Police Department.
The clerk vaguely recalled the transaction.
Investigating a credit card that was traced back to
She remembered that a blonde woman came into the store and purchased an expensive set of earrings. The woman charged the items and signed her name, June Roberts.
anything about her? Can you tell me anything?
The clerk couldn't provide enough detail for a composite sketch, but she gave investigators a Xerox copy of an identical pair of earrings.
Is there anything else?
The blonde woman, whoever she was, had been linked to one of the victims.
And if you can think of anything.
The next purchase on June Roberts' credit card came from a hair salon.
You got the boy's name, that's correct.
A stylist there remembered the woman claiming to be June Roberts.
That's her name.
She said the woman was in her mid-30s with shoulder-length blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a medium build. She added that the woman had a young boy with her. According to her appointment book, his name was Jonathan Weaver. An artist was brought in to translate the stylist's description of the blonde woman into a composite sketch. Gradually, a face took shape.
Yes. What would you change about it?
But police still didn't know how this woman fit into the murders,
Because we want to keep moving around it.
and they had no way to put a name to her face. Pursuing their only other lead, investigators began searching for the young boy, Jonathan Weaver, who had been at the hair salon with the blonde woman.
It's very similar.
They contacted area public schools and found a child with that name. They went to his address and waited. But when they spotted the boy and his mother arriving home, they realized the mother didn't resemble any of the descriptions.
I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. How you doing?
Questioning confirmed that the boy had never been to that salon,
Not at all?
and neither recognized the woman in the composite.
No, I've never seen her.
Despite the setback, investigators refused to give up. The locations of the murders and the credit card purchases were all within a 5-mile radius of each other. Investigators knew their killer had to be hiding right under their noses.
She made more purchases there?
Yeah, she made
Hoping to generate a lead, they decided to run a check of all violent crimes recently reported within that same area.
victim's name.
The tactic turned up a possible clue. An elderly woman who owned an antique shop just blocks away from Canyon Lake had been recently assaulted.
And this young woman came in with
Dorinda Hawkins, still recovering in the hospital, had barely survived the attack. She told investigators that a blonde woman came into her antique shop to ask about framing. When she led the customer into the back to show her some samples, the woman suddenly attacked her from behind. Dorinda felt a rope tightening around her neck.
she had a rope around my neck.
She told detectives that she then began begging for her life.
Called 911.
You know, you can have whatever you want, take whatever you want. I have 8 children, let me live. And the suspect told her, I'm not doing this for the money.
Dorinda had been left for dead, but she managed to regain consciousness. When she came to, her red-coiled key band that held the keys to the cash register was missing from her wrist,
Thing around my wrist.
and money from the register was also gone.
And she just kept choking. And I passed out.
When shown the composite, she positively identified the blonde as her assailant.
Yes.
It does.
It was now apparent to investigators that the suspect was not simply an accessory to the other crimes, she was the serial killer. And the rarest type of all, a woman. Investigators raced to put a name with the face on the composite sketch. Since Mary Pierce had known both of the murder victims, police hoped she might have also crossed paths with the killer.
No, this won't take long at all. Let me ask you this. Can you put a name to this face? Does this look familiar?
When shown the sketch, Mary said that the face kind of resembled her stepdaughter, Dana Sue Gray.
Sue Gray, that's my stepdaughter.
As Mary described her stepdaughter, the pieces started to fall into place.
Let me write that down.
The information fit the description of the suspect that I was looking for, and that She had a key to the first victim's house. She knew the second victim. She had a pass to get into Canyon Lake, and she was familiar with the area.
Mary added that Dana owned a house in Canyon Lake.
So you do know those two?
But Dana had just gone through a vicious divorce battle and was trying to sell the place because of the resulting financial ruin.
Take a look at those names and tell me if you recognize them.
Her job as a registered nurse was not enough to support the affluent lifestyle she had come to enjoy. The positive identification of the sketch and the information provided by Mary Pierce led detectives to obtain a warrant to search Dana Sue Gray's property. But that would take time. And given the suspect's propensity for violence, they didn't want to give her a chance to kill again. Undercover officers immediately put her under surveillance. Riverside County investigators continued looking into Dana Sue Gray's background. They learned that she was currently dating a man who had a young child named Jonathan Weaver, the same name as the child who had been at the hair salon.
No, I was out of town on business.
But this Jonathan Weaver was enrolled in private school.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
You remember that one?
Previously, detectives had only searched public school records. Later that afternoon, one of the officers picked up Dana's trail in nearby Sun City as she entered a bank.
She's going in the bank right now.
When she left a few minutes later, Dana was seen stuffing a large amount of cash into her purse.
Okay, we're gonna go and search.
A few hours later, Riverside police had obtained their search warrant. Detective Greco briefed the team on the items of evidence they were looking for once they made their way inside the suspect's house.
We had receipts from the different locations that the purchases were made for these various items, so they knew exactly what they were looking for. Also, I had directed the searchers to collect all of the shoes within the residence because of obviously the first victim's the shoe print in the first victim's case.
In the early evening hours of March 16, 1994, Riverside County investigators took suspected serial killer Dana Sue Gray into custody. She was taken to the Riverside Police Station for questioning. Inside the residence, investigators uncovered a wealth of evidence. They located a red-coiled key wristband, identical to the one stolen from Dorinda Hawkins at the antique shop. They also found merchandise similar to items purchased with June Roberts' credit cards. Inside Dana's purse, police made an ominous discovery. There was $1,900 in cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe. The address on the checks was from Sun City. Though Dora Beebe's name meant nothing to investigators, they knew that Dana Sue Gray had been in Sun City earlier that day.
A lot of money in here.
The search continued into the bedroom.
Okay.
What do you got?
There, evidence technicians found a pair of Nike sneakers. The evidence was sent to the crime lab.
Dana, you understand why you're here, don't you?
At the police station, Dana Sue Gray appeared calm and unaffected. She denied killing or assaulting anyone.
I think it looks exactly like you.
She admitted using credit cards belonging to June and another woman, whose name she couldn't remember, but claimed she had found them lying next to a dumpster.
You know what? Can I see those earrings?
Investigators collected Dana's earrings, which appeared to be the ones purchased on June Roberts' credit card.
These look very familiar to me.
As the detective left the interview to process the earrings, another investigator was waiting to speak to him outside. there had been another murder. The MO was identical to the Norma Davis and June Roberts homicides. The latest victim had been killed earlier that day in her home, which was located in Sun City. Riverside, California police believed that the suspect in the murders of Norma Davis and June Roberts was finally in their custody. As they questioned Dana Sue Gray about the murders, detectives were informed that Dora Beebe, an elderly resident in nearby Sun City, had been found murdered. That crime scene bore the same signature as the other homicides in Canyon Lake. Detectives realized they had found cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe while searching Dana's house.
Is there anything else you maybe want to tell
Dana Sue Gray had killed again, just a short while before the surveillance on her began.
And you found June Roberts' credit cards in the dumpster, too.
Now, they needed to be certain that she would never be free to kill again. At the crime lab, examiners analyzed the sneakers recovered from Dana Sue Gray's bedroom. They were size 6.5 Nike Air sneakers, the same style and size as the print recovered from the Norma Davis crime scene. Analysis of the characteristics that distinguish one shoe print from another left investigators with little doubt that Dana Sue Gray's shoes had left the print in Norma's condo. Unable to explain away all of the evidence amassed against her, Dana Sue Gray had no choice but to confess to her crimes. Riverside County investigators believe that Dana Sue Gray was driven over the edge by her financial misfortunes that resulted from her divorce. Angry and envious, she chose affluent victims, sometimes strangers, but mostly friends and relatives, as targets for murder. To avoid the death penalty, Dana Sue Gray pled guilty to the multiple murders. She was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
When I think of Dana Sue Gray, the first thing that comes to mind, for me anyway, is evil. It's just evil.
There are usually patterns to serial murder, though they're often hard to detect. Only time, patience, and meticulous forensic science can delve into the unknown and finally bring them to light. But ultimately, that's what detectives need to stop the killers who are driven by bloodlust.